It's an honor for me to introduce Dr. Deloris Wright. Dr. Wright is a managing principal at Analysis Group, which is a business economics and financial consulting firm. Her specialty is economic studies that deal with transfer pricing. And she has worked in a wide array of industries ranging from computer hardware and software, manufacturing, food industries, and services. Prior to working with Analysis Group, she was leading the transfer pricing work at Charles River Associates and Coopers and Lybrand. She has also worked with the IRS for 4 years, and where she gained valuable experience in intercompany pricing audits. She has lectured and published extensively in the field of transfer pricing in various prestigious finance forums and journals. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Wright.
I'm going to change the tenor of the discussion a little bit because I'm an economist. I want to try to step back from the conversations that we've heard in the last two speakers and just look at the big picture a little bit from an economic perspective. I should start out with a little bit of a disclaimer, though. I do not do research in this area. There are a lot of academic economists who do, a lot of Wall Street types who do. What I'm going to do, though, is to talk to you about my experiences in international business. I started working in international business back in about 1979 when I started working with the Internal Revenue Service auditing international transfer pricing situations. As I was listening to our friend from Rolls-Royce speak, I was thinking about all of the transactions that must be occurring within Rolls-Royce worldwide. That company is transferring product. It's sometimes probably work in process, sometimes finished goods. It's transferring intangibles. The intellectual property challenges that Rolls-Royce must have are incredibly interesting kinds of transfers and very difficult to deal with. There are probably also services, selling services, accounting services, marketing services that are being provided by one Rolls-Royce company for a related company in another geography. I think it was one of his slides in the lower right-hand corner said governments want to tax. And in fact, governments do want to tax the transactions that occur within a multinational. So Rick Pate from Eli Lilly, who got me involved in this affair this evening, has been one of my clients for longer than either one of us wants to admit, I think, where we've been dealing with just these issues. So what I want to do with you, though, is not talk about that, but rather talk about some of the globalization that has occurred over the last 30 years. I think that this Rajiv speech probably frightened a number of you. The outsourcing that's going on these days are a bit threatening to probably all of our jobs. And there's a tendency sometimes, I think, to be a bit frightened by that kind of change, particularly the speed with which it's happened over the last 10 years or so. So let's try to put it in perspective if we can. If we go back to the start of my career, there was some manufacturing that occurred outside of the home country of a corporation. In my experience, U.S. companies went to Europe, to the developed parts of Europe, and put in manufacturing plants that made product, usually soup to nuts, to sell it in the local market. So you were taking production for taking care of foreign markets, and it was in developed countries. There were no round-trip transactions. When I talk about round-tripping, I mean you have a U.S. company that developed technology here, then has the product produced outside of the United States and ships the product back into the U.S. for resale to U.S. customers. When I started my career, there was very, very little of that was going on. It was always producing in the foreign country for the foreign market. And it's only been in probably the last 20 years that we've seen anything different. But before I talk about that, what I'd like to do is to talk a bit about jobs moving from one part of the world to another part. We in this country have been dealing with that for a number of years. Think about what has happened over the last 20 years or so as jobs have moved from the northern states in the United States into the southern states in the United States. Think about the automobile industry, for example. When the Japanese companies came to the United States to form assembly plants, where did they put them? They put them in the southern states. Why was that happening? It's because labor wage rates got out of whack with the market in the northern part of the country. The southern part of the country was not unionized, so labor was cheaper. And frankly, governments gave all sorts of tax incentives to companies to put plants in the southern part of the country. Companies are profit maximizers. It's being called shareholder value these days. We economists still call it profit maximizing. Take that fact with the fact that the U.S. market tends to be an extraordinarily competitive market. A lot of my clients would say that the U.S. is the most competitive market in the world. Margins are lower in the U.S. market than they are in many, many other markets around the world, pharmaceuticals notwithstanding. Most companies are making, had to say that for you, Rick. Most companies are making lower margins and sell at lower prices in the States than in most other countries in the world. So that means that a company has to be very concerned about the cost of producing their products. So they're going to go to the place where they can get those costs as low as possible, given the constraints that they face. My point here is this is normal. This is a normal thing that goes on in business. And yes, it causes some disruption, but it's something that we all adapt to, and things work at the end of the day. Internationally, as I said, there was very little round tripping. Why is that? Well, you have various barriers that were set up. One of the barriers tended to be transportation costs. It was expensive to make a product in a foreign market and ship it back to the U.S. So you had to get quite a saving to make that make sense. Secondly, were tariff barriers. Governments have been good about creating barriers to foreign goods coming into their country. U.S. is one of those that's done it, so is everybody else. As transportation costs became lower, as tariffs began to fall, you found that companies were beginning to think about round tripping. The first place that I became aware of that we had round tripping was in the very labor-intensive manufacturing processes. Toys, clothing are a couple of very good examples. A lot of toys that are sold, I'd say the vast majority of them in this country are coming from China and have been for many, many years. Clothing is being made in Latin America. One of my clients makes men's underwear. Do you know that the vast majority of men's underwear is made in the Caribbean, in some of the islands in the Caribbean, where labor is extraordinarily low cost? When a company is thinking about manufacturing offshore, selling back into the U.S., the things that they think about are what we in the tax world call location savings. That location savings is kind of a term that applies to a relatively complex sort of analysis that gets done. I'm going to use Puerto Rico as my example. Puerto Rico was one of the first tax havens that existed. For those of you who don't know, Puerto Rico passed some legislation, I think it was in 1963, that was designed to lead to economic development of the island. It's called Operation Bootstrap, and what it said was income that's earned in Puerto Rico by employing Puerto Ricans will be free of Puerto Rico tax. At the same time, the U.S. government passed a similar law which said that that same income would not be taxed in the United States if and when it was repatriated to the U.S. So it was a great tax haven situation. But in the early years, it was difficult to put very much production there. Because when you did the location savings analysis, you found on the one hand that labor costs were a lot lower. You found also that you saved a lot in federal income tax by being there. But the infrastructure didn't exist. The road system within Puerto Rico was non-existent in the interior. There were not good hospitals. There were not good schools. The telephone system didn't work very well. I can remember several of my clients telling me when I was down there that if the boss from the U.S. called and you didn't like what the guy was saying, you would just say, hello, hello, I can't hear you, and hang up. That was a common thing that you heard because the phone system was very unreliable. The electricity in that island was very difficult to get, expensive, and not at all reliable. So companies were a bit reluctant, without the huge tax break, to invest in that country. Or I guess I shouldn't call Puerto Rico a country. The location saving analysis then had to weigh the positive labor saving against the negative higher costs. And I should mention one other cost which was extraordinarily important as well. In many of the developing parts of the world, I'll call them tax havens because that's what the world I deal with, the middle management simply didn't exist 20 years ago. The education system in those places had not developed a set of middle managers who could manage the business that was required to operate a manufacturing plant appropriately. I think every one of my clients in the early years managed their foreign manufacturing plants with U.S. expats. As was pointed out earlier, an extraordinarily expensive way to go. But it was the only way in those early years that management could be put in place that would take care of making sure that the product was made appropriately. As we go forward through the years, all of these problems that I've been talking about began to be solved. In Puerto Rico, it happened, I think probably 15 years ago. The infrastructure in Puerto Rico was pretty much fully developed. They had a middle management level of folks there who could handle Puerto Rico manufacturing. And same thing was happening in a variety of other places around the world. Singapore is another extraordinarily good example of economic development that led from simple manufacturing on up to much more complex manufacturing as time went by. And what happened in the U.S. then was that more and more goods began to be manufactured outside the States and imported back in. Electronics is an example. I don't think that there's been a television set or a radio or a telephone made in the U.S. in an awfully long time. We've been importing those kinds of products for a good period of time. And then today, of course, we have a lot of jobs going offshore. We're all familiar with the arguments under NAFTA that Mexico is going to take all our jobs away from us and there'd be no manufacturing in the States, it'd all be in Mexico. Bit alarmist, hasn't really happened. But what is the end game here in terms of manufacturing? I think that there are a couple of comments to make. First of all, if you look over time at a number of these places where labor wage rates were low and they became very important manufacturing places like Puerto Rico, like Singapore, to a certain extent like Ireland. Those places have begun to price themselves out of the market. There is very little new manufacturing going into Puerto Rico. Why? Because the labor wage rates in Puerto Rico are now higher than most of the area in the rest of the Caribbean, and the tax savings have gone away. So jobs are migrating out of Puerto Rico and into the Dominican Republic and into Haiti and into a number of other places like that. An economist looks at that and says what's going to happen is we're going to have an equilibration of wages, that U.S. manufacturing wages are going to go down over time and foreign manufacturing wages are going to go up over time. Now, are we going to get to exactly the same wage rate? Of course not. There will always be reasons why you need to manufacture here as opposed to somewhere else. But there is going to be a rebalancing of wage rates over time. How do we deal with that? We as a country need to find out how to be more productive. I say better, faster, smarter is what we have to do. It's an education, in my view. Furthermore, my personal thought is that the people who suffer the most from this sort of globalization are the middle class. Those folks who have historically had high school educations, if that, and who have worked in factories all of their lives, some of them protected by labor union contracts, some of them not. That's the class in our society who are going to be hurt by this. And I think we as a society would be very well served to look at the education that we're providing our people and make sure that we're doing as good a job as we can of preparing our citizens for this world and the global competition for jobs that's coming out of it. I was talking with Rick earlier today. One of my concerns is the education system and what's happening. 25 years ago, when I started hiring people for our business, the vast majority of the highest qualified people who applied for jobs were native-born Americans. Today, that is no longer the case. The majority of the highly qualified people who apply for jobs in our organization now are not U.S. citizens. And it's very difficult for us to find the number of people we need who are American. And as a result, in our office, there are 25 of us in the Denver office of Analysis Group, and about half of those folks are not U.S. citizens. And to me, that is an indictment of our education system. Certainly at the senior levels, and for the best and the brightest, our education system works extraordinarily well. But something's happening behind that, and I leave you with that thought. What about services? I think Rajiv did a very good job of talking about what's going on in the outsourcing of services. There, it's much easier to move that offshore than it is to move product manufacturing offshore. Why? Because you have little or no in the way of transportation costs. You have little or nothing in the way of import tariffs. And so it becomes, this location saving analysis I was talking about, becomes much more positive for services than it does for manufacturing. And so we're seeing all of the things that Rajiv talked about going on. Where is that going to go? It seems to me that there are some limits on what can be done. Until about 2 weeks ago, I thought that hospitals and physicians were pretty much safe from this. And then I read an article, I think it was the Wall Street Journal or something, 2 or 3 weeks ago, that people are being encouraged to go to India for their hip replacement and their valve replacement, heart valve replacement surgery. It's good for India. I'm not sure I want to ride in an airplane that long to get a new hip, but that's another point altogether. But there is very little that is safe from outsourcing. So what do we do? What is the key to our survival? Better, smarter, faster. We have to be more productive employees. Certainly, relative wage rates are going to change. U.S. wages have to go down over time. As I said earlier, they won't be equal, but they're going to have to go down over time. I'd like to end up, so far, all I've talked about is on the labor side. But let's now look at the other side of the coin, which is, are we better off with this sort of international trade or not? I think it would be easy to conclude from what I've said so far that maybe we're not better off because our jobs are in danger, wages are going to tend to fall. I think the other side of the coin is our standard of living is higher because of what's going on globally. We have more goods and services available to us today at lower costs than would be the case without the globalization. So we've got to balance the good with the bad here and recognize, in my personal view, we are better off, net, with globalization than we are without it. The question was raised earlier is, are we going to go to protectionism as opposed to allowing and encouraging international competition? I hope we will not make that choice. I hope we will decide to allow globalization to continue and that we will all learn how to compete in this world. Americans can compete with anybody when we put our minds to it. We just need to put our eye on the ball and make sure that we are prepared, that we're educated, we're motivated, and it'll be better for all of us at the end of the day. That's my cheerleader speech.